God called David a man after my own heart. But how does a flawed man earn a title like that? Before he ever wore a crown, David was marked, anointed in secret, called by God, and set apart for a destiny he couldn't yet understand. But the same man who stood fearless in a valley would one day crumble in a palace. David's life was sealed by calling, attested by waiting, pressure, and desire. In caves, he learned restraint. On a throne, he learned responsibility. And in failure, he learned what mercy costs. That's the moment the seal becomes real, because a seal isn't proof you'll never fall. It's proof you know where to return. Today, we'll follow David from the fields to the throne and into the prayer that still restores people today. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Psalms chapter 51, verse 10.
The night wind moved across Jerusalem like a living thing, cool, restless, carrying the scents of olive oil smoke, stone dust, and distant hearth fires. The city below was quiet, but not asleep. Lamps still burned in upper windows. Watchmen paced along walls. Somewhere in a narrow alley, a baby cried and was hushed. On the rooftop of the king's house, David stood alone. He no longer moved like the young warrior who once ran toward giants. Age had taught him caution. His shoulders were still broad, but the strength in them felt different now, less like a weapon, more like a weight. In his palm he held a ring. Not gold, not jeweled, not the kind of thing foreign kings would boast about. It was iron, banded with a thin line of silver, scratched by years of use. The face of the ring carried an engraved mark, two triangles interlocked, one rising, one descending, lines crossing like a covenant bound in metal. David rolled it between his fingers and stared at it as if it could speak. A seal. A king's seal could close letters, command armies, decide life and death with a pressed imprint. But David had learned something no tutor could teach. The most dangerous letters were the ones written in the heart, and the most powerful seal was the one that marked a man's soul. He lifted his eyes to the heavens. The stars looked close, bright, almost sharp, and the past opened inside him like a door. Long before he ever wore a crown, David had known what it meant to be marked. Not by ink, not by a brand, by calling. Samuel's hands had been firm when the prophet poured oil over David's head in his father's house. The scent of it, sharp and holy, had stayed on David's skin for days. And though no one else could see it, David felt like something invisible had settled upon him. A seal, not a symbol for others to admire, but a sign between him and God. That night, while his brothers celebrated and whispered and wondered what it could mean, David had slipped away to the fields. He sat beneath a sky littered with stars and asked the only question a chosen boy dares to ask.
Why me?
The sheep shifted beside him, and the night answered with silence. But David remembered something his mother once said when he was very small.
Some marks are not meant to make you famous. Some marks are meant to keep you faithful.
Years later, when Saul's jealousy turned into a hunt, David learned the weight of being chosen. He ran through caves and ravines, sleeping with one eye open, surrounded by men who were desperate, angry, and hungry. They believed in him, yes, but belief does not always feel like comfort. One evening in the wilderness, a craftsman in his band, an older man named Eliab, not his brother but a wandering metalworker who had joined their ranks, offered David a ring.
It's not gold,
The man said.
but it will last, and it will remind you.
Remind me of what?
David asked, turning it over. Eliab pointed upward where the stars burned cold and bright.
Two things that meet in one,
The craftsman said quietly.
heaven and earth, God's promise and man's obedience, mercy and justice. When you forget who you are, you will act like a beast. When you remember who you belong to, You will act like a king, even before you ever sit on a throne.
David slid the ring onto his finger, and in that moment he understood. A seal is not a decoration. A seal is a reminder of authority and responsibility. When the crown finally came, it didn't feel like a triumph. It felt like weight. Jerusalem rose under David's rule. Songs were written, victories were celebrated, nations trembled. And yet, in the quiet corners of his own heart, David battled something worse than Philistine steel, his own desires. One terrible season, when he should have been at war, David stared too long at what wasn't his. And the moment he took what belonged to another, he felt it, the seal within him cracking like clay. He wore a crown, but he forgot the God who placed it there. Afterward, when the prophet Nathan confronted him, David didn't argue. He didn't pretend. He broke. He fell to the floor like a man struck by lightning, and the ring on his finger clinked softly against the stone. That sound, small, sharp, felt louder than any trumpet. David wept until his throat burned, and in the ashes of his pride, he prayed the prayer of a sealed man who had tried to live unsealed.
Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me.
He understood then. A seal is not proof that you will never fall. A seal is proof that when you fall, you must return. Years passed. War came again, this time from inside his own home. Absalom, betrayal, grief that tore through David like a spear. And now, older, the king stood on his rooftop again, holding the ring as Jerusalem slept. He had learned something the young shepherd never could have understood. God's mark does not erase pain. God's mark does not cancel consequences. God's mark does not make a man perfect. But God's mark does call a man back. David looked at the etched shape again. Two triangles joined, not separated. In his mind, it became a lesson. 1 point upward, God is above. 1 point downward, God comes near, the Most High, and yet the one who meets the broken-hearted. David closed his fist around the ring and whispered into the night,
Let my name be remembered for the God who forgives, not the sins that shamed me.
and as the wind moved through Jerusalem, it felt as if heaven itself answered, not with thunder but with peace. Because the truest seal of David was never ink pressed into wax. It was a life that kept returning to the Lord. A real seal isn't a symbol you show off, it's a covenant you live out. David's greatness wasn't that he never fell, it was that he always came back to God with a surrendered heart.